This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end.
And with a intro from Jim Morrison and the Doors, we reach our last lecture for History 102. And we're going to talk about a new world order. And we're also going to talk about some of those echoes from the past that are revisiting us now. And what does that mean for the future? And is there an end to history? So before we go further, let's go ahead and view a few terms. The first one we're going to revisit, which is neoliberalism. I know I've been harping on this, but it's actually about a century-old idea. It was first proposed in Austria in the 1930s, and the idea is essentially a enshrinement of the sanctity of a business as an individual. That individual, the business individual, corporate entity, if you will, should be immune to regulations, to laws, to anything that gets in its way of making a profit. This is often taken to extremes with an emphasis in political arenas with a revisiting of laissez-faire uh, policies, the repealing of regulations, the repealing of those safeguards that we talked about a few weeks ago, and talking about opening up markets, the moving and liquidity of capital, that is money. And the idea is, at least nominally, that by liberalizing the economy, you liberalize the people who participate in that economy. There are many critiques to that, but we'll get to those, especially when we get towards the end. Now, post-liberalism is a critique of neoliberalism that posits that the pursuit of profit, above all, has led to many problems, including environmental disaster, wealth inequality, corruption, diminishing standard of living for developed nations, political instability, and a whole host of other issues. Um, Now, we're also going to talk about the critique of post-liberalism and honestly the critique of people protesting the liberalization of trade because like many things in human history, there are no real total good things and no real total bad things. Obviously, one tends to overshadow the other. For example, the movement towards fascism, that suspicion of capitalism, could be construed as a good thing. That embracing of the folk, the Volk, the people, the idea that the people are part of the state is part of the people, they're working in conjunction, that is sometimes seen as a good thing. However, the bad thing that way overshadows it is, of course, the repression of individuals, the murder, systemic murder in the case of the German uh, uh, example, systemic murder of entire categories of people. And then finally, we're going to talk about post-truth. I never in my life thought I would talk about a post-truth world. But here we are. It is a cynicalist belief by those who pretend to be smarter than the average person, seeing the inconvenience of truth as a obstacle to overcome. This is a cynical approach to the world, that there is no underlying truth, that everything is all made up, every person's out for themselves. The winners get, the losers don't, that sort of thing, this post-truth idea. And this leads to some dangerous problems. A suspicion of experts. For example, a really good example is the protests around social distancing and washing your hands and testing and all the sort of stuff that is emerging in the latter part of this month for the COVID-19 restrictions. The rhetorical idea that, well, what do doctors know? I mean, they've only spent their entire adult life learning about diseases and how to prevent them, but let's go ahead and get our hair cut. And anyway, as we were, it's also suspicion of evidence. A good example of that is, again, to visit this, the suspicion that 5G towers are somehow creating this virus. As wacky as that sounds, people have been attacking cell phone towers, they've been cutting telephone lines, they've been doing all sorts of weird, irrational things because of the post-truth lies that are building up. This leads to a rise in anti-science and belligerent ignorance as a right. Often the refrain is, do you think you're better than me? No, I just know more than you on this particular subject. That sort of thing. They often counter evidence with claims of fake news, or that's propaganda, or that's lies, or it's a conspiracy theory to shut us up. Now, are there conspiracies? Probably, absolutely. Is everything a conspiracy theory? Probably not. I don't think nurses and doctors on the front lines are creating a conspiracy theory. It's not like they had a big old freaking Zoom meeting across the entire planet to conspire to keep you from, I don't know, going to Five Guys or whatever. I don't think that was the conspiracy. I honestly don't. So, those are our terms. And now we're moving on and we're going to talk about the end of the Cold War. Now, the Soviet Union and the United States had been in a rivalry for close to about 30 or 40 years by the time we get to the 1970s, when the United States and the Soviet Union, having had that close call in the 1960s, begin to thaw their relationship. It's a phenomena called détente. We've visited this before. It was a relationship between the French and Germans right before World War I, this kind of thawing of relationships, not really trust for each other, but at least not absolute unthinking rivals. You say left, I say right. You say up, I say down, that sort of thing. So that continues through the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1980s, the election of a celebrity to the office of the President of the United States, that is of Ronald Reagan, the actor turned politician, he was able to reframe the relationship with the Soviet Union as one of rivalry again. And so we get to see a ramping back up of the rhetoric of the Cold War, this idea that the Soviet Union is an existential threat to the United States and the quote free world, or that the United States and the Western Europe is an existential threat to the quote workers' revolution. And so we get this buildup, this military buildup. The United States begins to confront on every world stage that it can leverage the Soviet Union, especially talking about the brutal repression within the Soviet Union, repression of dissidents, repression of political rivals, repression of independence movements, a whole host of ways in which the United States pointed out the egregious human rights abuses that were present in the Soviet Union and in communist regimes in general, such as China and Cambodia, in Latin America, and that sort of thing. This is a PR front that is really actively opened on the United States to really take the initiative and play the case out on the world stage that the Soviet Union is bad, the United States is good, therefore anything associated with the Soviet Union, including communism or collectivism or anything like that, is bad, and everything associated with the United States, including liberalism or neoliberalism, globalization, is good. Unfortunately, it elides a lot of the issues that the United States is also responsible for, such as the support of brutal dictatorial regimes, of looking the other way, of funneling terrorists. Yes, the United States did indeed funnel money towards terrorists. We need look no further than in Afghanistan. The United States supported a small group of fighters known as Al Qaeda to fight against the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden, in particular, as one of the emerging leaders of Al Qaeda in the 1970s and early 80s, received CIA training on how to counter large convoys, of how to counter bases of operation, how to counter aircraft like helicopters and things like that. So the irony there is not lost on you if you are aware of who Osama bin Laden is. So the United States, however, is able to leverage a lot of things, particularly monetary debt. One of the other arenas in which the United States challenges the Soviet Union is through military buildup. After the Vietnam War, the United States had begun reducing the military levels of Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Army because there wasn't a need for that war, for that money, because there was no war going on. Well, in the 1980s and then early 1980s, Ronald Reagan engages in some deficit spending. He borrows way more than the United States is taking in taxes. The idea is that eventually the United States will be able to pay this back, or that a certain level of debt is good. There are certain financial mindsets that say a certain level of debt is good for a nation, and that just happens to coincide with a need for increased military spending. The United States is able to leverage debt much more effectively than the Soviet Union because the United States is participating in a world economy, an integrated world economy that it largely helped build and sustain. So things like stock exchanges, Treasury Department exchanges, bond markets, that sort of thing. It's able to leverage a lot of that more than the Soviet Union is. So this leads to funding of the military, but also funding of foreign aid. Often foreign aid came in the form of food, expertise, or military hardware, which in a way was just basically revisiting that military buildup. A lot of money got funneled into the military industrial complex. But there's also some financial assistance as well for emerging economies that gravitated towards the United States. There were many, many, many strings attached. We won't get into those, unfortunately, because this is only a freshman level class. So the Soviet Union did have a fairly good economy. I know this seems to fly in the face of a lot of the textbooks that say that Soviet Union was like this kind of dull gray place where nobody really got ahead except party elites, and the party elites, even then, their level of wealth and access was limited compared to the United States. That not exactly true. There was a middle class in the Soviet Union, largely a part of the bureaucracy of the government, largely in charge of manufacturing cars or farm equipment or whatever like that, or largely in charge of administering the food distribution center. The problem is in the 1970s, there begins to be this disconnect between the middle class and the average Joe. Now, it didn't have as big, the Soviet Union did not have as big a middle class as the United States did in the 1960s and 70s, but there was a middle class. And they were enjoying a lifestyle that was often very much more free in terms of being able to travel, very much more comfortable in terms of access to housing, access to food, access to travel than the average Soviet citizen. There was an increasing amount of people who were less well off. There were food shortages for the people who were at the bottom of the Soviet hierarchy, and this seems to exacerbate tensions within the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. There's a lot of secretive organizations that are very anti-government. Well, a lot of this comes crashing down when the United States begins to isolate the Soviet Union economically. One of the big exports for the Soviet Union, and indeed one of the big exports for Russia now, is oil. A lot of oil was produced in the Soviet Union, and a lot of it was exported relatively cheaply. The United States leveraged relationships with oil-producing partners, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iraq, particularly Iraq under Saddam Hussein, who received rather robust American support throughout the 1980s to export oil cheaply. And make matters worse, the Iranian regime had also been experiencing issues with their economic flow, having faced embargoes with the United States, and so it was in a way undercutting Soviet oil sales as well, because the only people who could buy from Iran were those who were not part of the larger world economy, places like India or China. And if you had to choose between Iran and the Soviet Union, you could negotiate prices a lot lower. They were basically captive sellers. Uh, the United States also embargoes Soviet-aided countries, putting pressure on them to distance themselves from the Soviet Union. This famously did not work with Cuba, but it did work with Venezuela, with Egypt, with several other African nations in order to distance them from the Soviet Union. So there's not any income coming from purchasing military equipment or grain or whatever from the Soviet Union. And to make matters worse, the United States really does push this rivalry, kind of almost frenemy relationship that the Soviet Union and China developed in the 1960s and 70s. In the 1940s and 50s, Soviet Union and China were fairly close. China viewed by the Soviet Union as a kind of client state, or as like a little brother, for lack of a better term. China seeing the Soviet Union as kind of like the vanguard who was helping export the revolution, but eventually the attitudes towards each other sour, and China begins to drift away from the Soviet sphere and towards a more what we call an authoritarian capitalism. We see that emerging in the 1980s after Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping visits Singapore and sees that a structured, centrally directed economy by a political party that does not have to worry about being reelected is actually very effective. And we see the fruits of that labor that began in the 1980s playing out even today, with China becoming the second largest economy in the world about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So the Chinese are philosophically beginning to drift away from the Soviet Union. This leads to a lot of rhetorical issues, and so the United States really relies on China being the quote good communist unquote nation to counter the Soviet influence. So when you have multiple communist nations competing for, let's say, agricultural equipment that they're selling to developing countries, you know, obviously there's a lot more influence, a lot more favoritism towards Chinese markets. So in a way, the United States really paved the way for China to dominate the world economy in the way that it has. All this leads to eventually a collapsing of what's referred to as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is a reference to a speech by Winston Churchill where he talked about the closing of Eastern Europe, that across Europe has fallen an Iron Curtain. Beyond which nothing can penetrate. It is this kind of balkanization of Europe. Well, that Iron Curtain comes crumbling down. Now, the Soviet Union was not ignorant of the issues it was facing. And in fact, the Soviet premier at the time, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to reform the Soviet economy along Chinese lines. Along with that economy, he also loosened up some restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protesting the government, that sort of thing. The problem was there was so much pressure built up in the Soviet Union compared to, say, China, which did not let up on that on the repression of dissidents, which did not allow a freedom of speech, which did not allow a liberalization of rights the way it did the liberalization of the economy. Um, the Soviet Union, because of all that pent up pressure, began to crumble from the inside out. Um, by 1991, in November 1991, there had been a distancing of the East German government from the Soviet, uh, I guess, mentors, we'll use the word for, and the Berlin Wall began to be disassembled. The Berlin Wall was a very visible, for lack of a better term, pardon the pun, concrete example of the division between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. With the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we see the reunification of the city of Berlin, which was a presaging of the reunification of the modern state of Germany. There was no longer an East Germany and a West Germany. Now there was one united Germany. The Soviet Union collapses shortly thereafter in 1992, breaking into about 15 or 16 different nation states, each of which had their own uh, direction to go, many of whom join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in an ironic twist of fate. And the United States is largely left without a rival. Without that rival, the United States now embarks on a period of um, a new world order, to borrow the phrase from George H.W. Bush. Um, he rhetorically set the United States on the course of leading the world, continuing to lead the world, not only as a superpower, but also as a stabilizing influence in this chaotic world. The social order that had been expected for about 60 years, 50 years, from 1940-ish all the way to 1990-ish, had suddenly been upended. The Soviet Union was no more. Russia was relatively chaotic in the 1990s, begins to experience some of that opening and some of that interconnectedness. And so with that change comes a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty. So the United States takes the leadership and begins to reshape their foreign policy. No longer are they, is the United States really emphasizing stability over freedom. For the majority of the Cold War, rhetorically, the United States was very happy to talk about the freedom of the Western world, about the free world versus the communist world, about how free America was. There was lots of songs about how free America was without really defining what free was. That freedom did not necessarily extend philosophically across the borders. The United States supported authoritarian dictators in the Philippines, in Panama, in Chile, Brazil, in Africa, in the Middle East with Saddam Hussein, before him the Shah of Iran, and even after Saddam Hussein with the Saudi royal family. And the United States no longer is really concerned with defeating minor communism. Cuba is still kind of a sore point politically, largely because of internal political considerations. The Cuban American population in Florida, for example, and in New York were very vocal in their desire not to see a return to normalcy with the relationship with Cuba. But other than that, the United States really not that interested in defeating communism abroad. A good example of that is Vietnam. Vietnam is now still a communist nation, but it is one of the most robust trading partners with the United States. Does the United States want to overthrow the communist regime in Vietnam? No, has not really ever been really interested in that. And again, the United States begins to revisit this idea of humanitarian issues. Under George H.W. Bush and his successor, Bill Clinton, a lot of humanitarian issues in the 1990s begin to be addressed. Things like famine, things like war, things like civil war, ethnic cleansing, that sort of thing. The United States becomes involved in one way or another in trying to resolve these conflicts and to essentially end them, to try to basically come to a peaceful solution. Now, dictatorships are kind of a touchy subject. The United States had been backing dictators for decades, and that begins to crumble in the early 1990s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, you no longer have this existential threat that you're making allies out of imperfect people, as the CIA would say. The alliance with dictators becomes increasingly untenable as, ironically, American media outlets are given a lot more free rein to report on the atrocities that are happening in formerly US-backed dictatorial regimes, um, and to highlight the abuses of human rights. So, a good example of this would be the individual pictured here on the right, Manuel Noriega. He was a longtime dictator of the country of Panama. He had been involved with the CIA in countering uh, communist insurgents and communist regimes throughout Latin America. And at the same time, the United States had turned a blind eye to his assistance in smuggling drugs into the United States. This, amongst other things, leads many in the United States to conclude that the CIA was, uh, if if not actively importing drugs to the United States to help fuel the uh, anti-communist movement, at least turning a blind eye because he was deeply involved in drug cartels that were smuggling cocaine and other addictive drugs into the United States, and he had helped them launder money. He had helped sell weapons to them. A lot of times he would get military aid. He would then sell a lot of that military aid to drug cartels and pocket the profits. So all that behavior becomes untenable after the collapse of the Soviet Union because now you don't have this existential threat to the West and to the United States. It was seen at the time in the 1990s, mid 1990s to late 1990s, that Russia would be a very close partner to the United States, and that Russia and the United States would forge a new world with a unified vision. Well, maybe that didn't work out to plan. So people, dictators like Augusto Pinochet in Chile and um, Marcos, Emmanuel Marcos in the Philippines, and Manuel Noriega in Panama. Those were all brought down either through the U.S. withdrawing aid and withdrawing assistance to that dictator, or, especially in the case of Manuel Noriega, of the U.S. literally invading and removing them. Now, we're going to shift a little bit, and in order to do that, we're going to talk about some economic um, rules of thumb that we're going to establish before we talk about neoliberalism. And so this is kind of a mini terms. First is developed nations. Developed nations, in the parlance of international economists, are those nations that have moved beyond the industrial era, that they've embraced either information service or maybe a service industry focused economy, things like insurance, brokering, uh, information technology, informatics, those sort of things. So these post-industrialized economies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Australia, that sort of thing. So those are developed nations. They've already gone through the industrial period and they've emerged on the other side. That's the idea. Developing nations are those that are in the middle or are beginning to develop their industrial capacity, that they haven't quite brought their economy to the point where you would have more of a focus on information, on technology, on post-industrial industries. You're more into the manufacturing of creating steel, or of creating concrete, or creating farm equipment, that sort of thing, building these things. So those developing nations are Brazil, South Africa, Russia, India, China, what will later be known as BRIC economies, BRIC economies. Um, and finally, we have underdeveloped countries. Underdeveloped countries, often referred to in certain circles as exploited countries, because they are often agricultural focused, export focused, minimal minimal developed products, or what is known as value added products, um, that are created in these countries and then used for export. Good example of this would be cacao production. The majority of chocolate that is consumed within the world comes from West Africa. A lot of those chocolate plantations, they are still harvested by hand. They are still watered by hand. There's very little in the way of mechanization. There's very little in the way of professional development. So few doctors, few educational opportunities, few infrastructure, that sort of thing. Agrarian-centric countries might even be very familiar with people living in and around Cincinnati. Guatemala, for example, is essentially, well, largely owned by the Chiquita Banana Company. The country itself isn't owned, but a lot of the land within Guatemala is owned by the Chiquita Banana Company, mostly for export of, you guessed it, bananas. So, our Chiquita Company, I shouldn't call them Chiquita Banana Company, but that's where a lot of their wealth comes from, is the importation of fruit. So, so neoliberalism is that U.S.-led financial institutions begin to put pressure on developing and underdeveloped nations to be the source of a global manufacturing system. A good example of this would be kind of like the triangle trade. Not quite, insofar as we're not moving human bodies, but a raw product is harvested in one country, shipped to a second country where it is manufactured into a finished project or product, or a value added product. And then that value added product is shipped to a third country, who then purchases it because they have a higher standard of living. They can pay a lot more. That money somehow filters slowly back to the developing country, and the cycle starts over again. Let's take, for example, chocolate, since we mentioned it before. Cacao is harvested in West Africa. It is maybe processed in someplace like Central America or in China. Once it's processed and turned into actual chocolate bars to be exported, it would then be sent to developed nations, whether it be Belgium or Switzerland or the United States, who then takes that raw chocolate, the cacao bars, and turns it into edible chocolate, whether it be Hershey bars or Lindt truffles or whatever. That's a good example of how this neoliberalist network is intended to work. The same can be true for things like cotton. The United States still does produce a lot of cotton, but not nearly as much cotton as it used to. A lot of that cotton is still being produced in places like India or Egypt or other underdeveloped or developing countries. So let's say it's developed, that's grown in Egypt. That Egyptian cotton is then sent to Bangladesh, where it is woven and turned into shirts. Those shirts then are brought to the United States and sold for a relatively high markup, relatively cheap compared to the standard of living in the United States, and that money filters back towards Egypt, which then goes back into growing more cotton. So there we go. Um, The idea behind neoliberalism is in order to make that manufacturing system more efficient, you need to erase the barriers to that trade. Things like tariffs, things like um, uh, taxes, of regulations and barriers. And in order to do that, you need multinational trade deals. Who negotiates multinational trade deals? Not the companies itself, but the governments. This reduces barriers to competition. So, in other words, the idea is that theoretically, American companies could compete with Canadian companies, with British companies, with French companies, German companies, whatever, and whoever is the most efficient and most cost effective at delivering their product would then be the winner in any particular exchange. That's the idea. And that would lead countries to innovate into better efficiencies, better education, much more educated workforces. That's the theory. Now, the effect, however, is that developing nations become producers. They become creators. A good example of this would be China and India, which have these emerging massive middle classes. The standard of living in China over the past 30 years has risen exponentially. Um, what does that mean? Well, it doubles essentially every year. Um, so China now has the largest middle class in the world. There are more people living in the quote middle class of China than there are living in the entirety of the United States. To give you an example, corporations are increasingly profitable year over year from the 1970s to 2000s. On average, international companies produce about 11% of the gross domestic product of developed nations year over year. So, for example, 11% of the gross domestic product, the amount of money generated within the United States, comes from those international companies. Places like Apple, places like Google, or um, let me see, goodness, I'm sorry, I blanked out. So Apple's an excellent example of that. American company, at least nominally American company, manufacturing in China, sourcing materials in Africa, and creating a product that is sold in the United States or in Western Europe for a relatively high markup. Apple is absolutely a very highly marked up product. A good example of that, or even clothes manufacturers, whether you get your Beats from Dre or you get your Yeezy shoes or whatever like that. Those are all sourced. The materials are sourced in one country, produced in another country, and then sold in your country or in another country. So if profit-driven motives have increased the profit of corporations, what does corporate-centered economic policies ignore? If we're talking about emphasizing the power of international companies, what does that ignore? Can free trade harm national economies? And then does more wealth generated within a country automatically equate to more freedom within that country? Well, there are a lot of issues that are ignored by neoliberalism and globalization. A good example of this would be environmental issues can be ignored. If a company is polluting in Bangladesh, do American consumers particularly care? Are they aware of it? Even if they are aware of it, can they do anything to affect it? Well, environmental issues can be ignored, especially because companies would, I guess, in a very kind of we are following orders way, say we are complying with all the laws of the country in which we are producing this product. A good example of this is Dow Chemical produces a lot of chemicals in India, everything from household bleach all the way up to industrial chemicals that are used for scientific experiments. Sometimes these production of these chemicals is done in a way that is not up to the standard of something that would be produced in the United States. This leads to safety issues. There have been many times in which manufactories have exploded and exposed vulnerable populations to contaminants downwind, leading to thousands of deaths and thousands more being rushed to hospitals. So things like climate change and environmental damage are largely ignored in favor of lowering these tariffs or lowering these regulations. Regulations on pollution are relatively high in developed nations for good reason, because the United States, other Western European nations have gone through those periods of industrialization, realize that polluting the rivers, polluting the air, polluting the land is bad for the people in the long run, and so introduced a lot of red legislation. This pushes companies to take their manufacturing elsewhere to look for exploitations where they can dump lead or mercury or cyanide or whatever into the groundwater or bury it under the ground or to pollute it in the air and not worry about it. Wealth inequality is also ignored. At the heart of neoliberalist geo globalization is this idea that if wealthy companies make a lot of money, they're going to pay their employees a lot of money in return to keep them happy, to keep them productive. That doesn't work. This is often referred to as trickle-down economics. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was a very big proponent of this idea of trickle-down economics. It is still a very popular platform in certain politically conservative Western countries, whether it's Australia, the United States, or the United Kingdom. The idea that you give tax breaks to the most wealthy, they are the so-called job creators, and when they get tax breaks, they're incentivized to go ahead and create more jobs. Reality is most economists who are credible say that this is nonsense. If you lower the taxes on people's income, they're not going to reinvest. They will then save that money. They will hoard that money. It is often referred to as voodoo economics. Ronald Reagan's greatest rival in 1980, a man named George H.W. Bush, who would later go on to be his vice president, referred to it as voodoo economics because it's relying on some kind of weird magic that actually doesn't work. The trickle-down theory does not work. Historically, it has never worked. I don't know why people keep buying into it, but there you go. There's also uncertainty in developed nations that as companies become more profitable, it does turn out that they do not pay their employees more money. Often they extract more productivity from their employees. They often cut jobs in order to increase their bottom line and then put more work upon their employees. This is true over the past 15 years. American productivity has gone up 40% per person. So we're 40% more productive than we were in, say, 2005. However, our wages have only risen 0.3% or 0.3%. So obviously, this work is not, or this money is not trickling down. Moreover, on top of that, human rights are often ignored. Things like refugee crises. A good example of this is the Chiquita Company has been implicated in paying money to gangs and terrorist organizations, both to leave their particular plantations alone, but also to breaking up strikes or to attacking those who are critical of Chiquita's policies within their respective countries, like Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, places like that. There can be widespread repression. A good example of this would be China. China is very repressive regime, extremely brutal regime. They have an incredibly growing economy. They have an incredibly dynamic and expanding middle class. But they're also very keen to keep the party in power, they are very keen to repress any voices against. So this leads to things like police states, where the arresting of protesters is a regular phenomenon, the spying on their own citizens, that sort of thing. So more money doesn't necessarily equate to more freedom. There is some stark reality as well that we must grapple with. In multiple Pentagon reports, and this is not a liberal think tank, this is not some bushy-eyed, tree-hugging, dirt-munching druid kind of thing. These are the people who look at threat analyses and see threats rising. So the same kind of reports that talked about the rising threat of Islamic terrorism in the 1990s are the same people that are talking about the rising threat of climate change. In 2013, 2015, and 2018, the effects of of a changing climate are an increasing national security risk. Why? Because it increases food scarcity, it increases political instability, and a decreased ability for the United States to predict where enemies will crop up next. The World Bank also noted that neoliberalism has led to an issue with climate change as well, noting that the poor people are typically the ones who are most disproportionately affected. The affluent can afford to move, for example, out of a region that is being affected by drought. The affluent can move, for example, out of an area that is expected to have floods, or even if it does flood, they often have the wherewithal, the capital, the insurance to rebuild as they had been before. The poor, however, often lack these issues. So while the rich are able to escape, even if just temporarily, the poor who are often stuck there are the ones who bear the brunt. They're the ones who die the most often. They're the ones who are economically impacted and often never recover and are pushed even further into poverty. And there's also a lot of issues that surround climate change with human health as well. Things like the rise of global temperatures leads to more air pollution hanging around and becoming more exacerbated. This air pollution can then lead to cardiovascular issues and breathing issues, things like asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, or COPD, and can lead to vulnerability for infections like COVID-19. The people who are most affected by COVID are those who are predisposed to have problems breathing to begin with. Those with reduced immune systems. A good example of this is extreme heat, often puts stress on people, puts stress on people's bodies. That stress response leads to inflammation. That inflammation leads to a reduced ability for the immune system to respond to any kind of diseases that come in, whether it's pneumonia, COVID, swine flu, whatever. Water and food supplies can be impacted. This leads to things like malnutrition, poor water. Malnutrition and poor water can lead to a repression of the immune system, which, again, I know I'm kind of hammering it home, but can lead you to a susceptibility of infection. So a lot of these are interconnected. So it's not just, oh, it's going to be a little bit hotter in July than it had been in the past. Big deal. This does have an impact on the body itself of the individual. So while you may be lucky enough or blessed enough to be healthy, maybe your neighbor's not, maybe your cousin's not, maybe your grandmother's not. So the United States had been a rather vocal and important leader on the world stage from, we'll say, from World War II all the way through to about 2015, 2016, when the United States began to pull away. The increasing instability, the increasing economic disparity that is being felt in the United States led to populist movements. Populist movements both on the left wing of American political spectrum and on the right wing of American political spectrum. A good example of this would be the Bernie Sanders phenomena that has attracted hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are giving to his campaign or were giving to his campaign. Another example of this would be the Trump rallies. And now a lot of times people say, well, how dare you compare, this party to that party? But there is an underlying truth, and that is that American people understand that there are things that are changing in the world, that their standard of living is different than it used to be. The United States used to be the gold standard, now not so much. Poverty is expanding, politicians are increasingly disconnected from the realities of American life, and the government in Washington seems not responsive at all. And so this leads to things like extremist ideology, the embracing of terrorism, international terrorism. Terrorism has always been with the world. It's become more exacerbated in the past 30-ish or 20-ish years. Really been accelerated by the ability of people to move and exchange ideas, particularly over the internet. Internet has really allowed for not only the dissemination of knowledge, but also the dissemination of propaganda and ideology. This leads to ultranationalism, things like white supremacist movements, of isolationist movements, and of course to the exacerbation of racial tensions, not just within the United States, but in other countries as well. Good example would be Rwanda. There's this Hutu and Tutsi tension that had existed in the 1990s that leads to the Rwandan genocide, had been largely resolved and is starting to kind of bubble up again. It's true in China. The Han majority, the ethnic Han majority, is putting down a lot of minorities, whether it be Tibetan minorities or Uyghur minorities or others on the Western Fringe. And a lot of this is based on racial differences or perceived racial differences. That also leads to a lot of protectionism, the kind of backing away from that neoliberalist idea of trying to reduce tariffs and reduce the barriers to trade, and a reintroduction of tariffs and the abrogation of treaties. A good example is the Paris Accords, and of course the engagement in trade wars. Now there are some promising points of light. There are worldwide protests and rebellions that are happening against authoritarian regimes that are angry at the repression of the right of speech, the right of congregation, the right of religious minorities, the right of individuals, but also economic issues. And that's happening not just in foreign countries like Iraq and Hong Kong, but in the United States as well. There have been large-scale protests, and honestly, I think. Um, most protests we should be encouraged by the sight of. We may not agree with their politics. We may think that they're approaching things incorrectly. We may even believe that what they're protesting is kind of silly or nonsensical. But we should also be encouraged by the fact that people felt motivated and had the freedom enough or had the courage enough to face off against their government. In some cases, like the United States, extremely low risk. Nobody's going to say boo to a bunch of, let's say, middle class white protesters who are upset that they can't go to the racetrack or whatever, right? Really not going to have the National Guard called out and shots fired. Very unlikely. But at the same time, people in Hong Kong face summary execution, they face rape, they face imprisonment, they face being disappeared, and so there's a lot of protests that we should also be encouraging and supportive of. The protests do share some common aims. As I mentioned before, the idea of income inequality, the expansion of freedom and democracy, also at the heart of a lot of these, whether it's left-wing politics or right-wing politics, let's go back to the Bernie and Trump rallies, human rights, the right of certain people to do certain things, of environmental issues. Yes, there is an increasingly aware right-wing response to environmental issues, and this leads to the common roots of populism just expressing in different ways, like a flower that has red petals on one flower, but then a different variety has blue petals on a blue on its own flower. So same type of flower, but maybe different permutations. At the heart, they're all the same issues that are causing it to grow. So is this an end for history, though? Right now, we're living in a post-industrial economy, and it really is a kind of unstable economy. COVID-19 has really exposed some of the issues that are at heart for this post-industrial economy. For example, getting proper PPE. A lot of this PPE is sourced. The materials are sourced in one country, produced in a second country, and then exported and sold in the United States. Well, the United States suddenly found itself without a supplier because it's a pandemic. It's affecting all countries. So the producer in this case being China, in the majority, being China. How are you going to get masks from a country that needs those masks and would probably appropriate those for their own uses? Also, a post-industrial economy leaves a lot of people out of a variety of jobs. We're also living in a period of post-truth politics where lying and name calling are often seen as a viable and even preferable defense to embarrassing truths that come out. We're also living we eventually will live in a post-COVID-19 healthcare situation where we realize that the people who are actually working the hardest are often abused the most. Nurses, in particular, often have to work very, very long hours, and bless their hearts for going into that profession. Nobody goes into nursing thinking that I'll be an incredibly rich individual. Most people who go into the healthcare field do it out of a desire to help other people. And it's that desire to help other people that keeps them wearing masks for 12 and 14 hours at a time, to the point where it damages their skin, and really exposes them to horrible pathogens. Unbeknown or largely unreported is many of the people who are getting sick from COVID-19 are actually healthcare professionals themselves. So we will eventually live in a post-COVID-19 healthcare world. And then finally, we do have to think about what happens if the United States continues its retreat from leadership in the world stage. What will happen in the world that we leave behind, that we decide to withdraw from? And hopefully we won't live in a post-United States world where autocrats and dictators establish the international norms. Hopefully we won't live in a world where human rights is seen as a novel concept that maybe somebody might get somewhere down the road. But all of these issues are causing us to re-examine a lot of things in our world that we take for granted. And that is the purpose of a history course. And that is the purpose of understanding history. Where do these issues come from? Where do economic beliefs come from? Are they written in stone, carved in stone at the beginning of time, or have they evolved over time? Have they become maybe outdated and outmoded, the way feudalism has become outdated and outmoded within the weeks that we've been together? Racial beliefs, have they also been ingrained in humans since the dawn of time, or have they become exacerbated for other ends, for political means? What about social beliefs? Where do all of those stem from? By examining history, we can see some of the roots of some of these social beliefs. Things like poverty. Where does poverty come from? Is poverty a failing of the individual? Is poverty an inevitable reality for many, many, many people? And how should we approach that? And then finally, political beliefs. Although often difficult to examine, they are arguably the most important to examine. The political beliefs that, let's say one party is bad or that another party is good or that one candidate is bad or one candidate is good, we really have to see beyond just the face. We have to look at what causes those movements, what causes those policies, what causes those parties to rise, and what are the roots of those. And that's the point of looking at history as well. So in conclusion, neoliberalism allows for more nations to expand their economies. Absolutely true. But it can be blind to its shortcomings. It does, those expansions sometimes, often, I should say, come at sometimes great cost to the people living within those countries. Exploitation, repression, and environmental disaster. Post-liberalism calls for a more focus on a human experience, emphasizing that there is more that unites us as a human race than divides us, that a lot of the things that divide us are artificial and they're created out of myths, legends, and lies. Limits of easy and angry answers can be exposed. When we talk about people being frustrated and people gravitating towards the person who has the easy answer, who says, I know the way, it's super easy, we just have to eliminate X, hopefully you can look back in the past and see that often that is not the case. Yes, the world is incredibly complex, but yes, that's the great beauty of it. And that makes the problems that much better, that much more satisfying to solve. If we gravitate towards easy answers, it can lead us down a very bad path. It can lead us down the path of hypocrisy and corruption and possibly even mass murder, as we saw with the World War II lecture. I am hopeful that as we end this course and as we end this term, that you will continue to investigate things with a historical eye, that say that you will not take for granted that somebody says, oh, well, this has been happening since forever. Has it? And even if it has been happening forever, is that necessarily a good thing? With that, I hope you all have a great final, an amazing summer, and I hope you all stay safe, healthy, and happy. Goodbye.